right. Camden, are you sure you read the right verses? I thought we were here tonight to talk about the Wisemen and baby Jesus, right? So why are you reading about furniture in a temple? I have been known to give the wrong passage from time to time, but I'll try to make this connect somehow. So we'll see. I'll bring it all together. All right, I'll make that work, Camden. So tonight we are continuing our series on the gift of the Magi. And if you were here last time, Tom started us off talking about the first of those three gifts that were brought: gold, and then there was frankincense, and then there was myrrh. And gold, frankincense, and myrrh, I want to again repeat the advice that Tom gave us last week, that if you are shopping for a toddler or an infant, this is not the best example of a gift to get them, right? So please get something else other than gold and essential oils for your young kids you're buying for. But these gifts are very important. That's why they're listed to us in the Bible. We don't know a lot about the people that brought them. We don't really know much about the wise men, although Tom and I may put something up on Instagram talking about some interesting theories about who they were and why they were here and why they knew that Jesus had been born. But the Bible doesn't clearly say who they were, but it does clearly say what they brought, right? So that must be very important, the fact that these three gifts are recorded. Last week, Tom explained to us that these gifts are symbolic, right? That the wise men brought gold as a representation that Jesus would be a king, although it turned out he was not the king that the Jews were expecting. Tonight, we're going to talk about that second gift, frankincense. So let's get started with that. Do y'all know what frankincense is? Yeah, I don't know about y'all, but every time I read this as a kid, I thought of this, right? Do y'all know Frankenberry? Yeah. Now that's a gift for an infant, all right? So get that for your kid, a nice bowl of Frankenberry, or even better, Blueberry, right? Am I right? Do y'all know about Blueberry? Do they still make Blueberry? All right. I think that's better than Frankenberry. No, frankincense is in fact a white resin or a gum made from the sap of a special tree, the boswellia tree. This tree only grows on the Horn of Africa, which is Somalia, Ethiopia, or in South Arabia or in India, okay? And to make frankincense, the boswellia tree is tapped. So you cut the bark, a very thin slice, which then allows the sap to run out onto the surface, as you see up there. It's kind of blocked by one of our presents. And then that's collected, and it's distilled down into this crystallized form that you see on the bottom. And this is a very, very slow and complex process, and it actually takes months to harvest and process a usable amount of frankincense. Okay, so what's the big deal about some tree sap, right? Well, the sap of the boswellia tree, or frankincense, is very high in some chemicals which just so happen to be extremely pleasant to smell, especially when they're burned. And our word frankincense, then, comes from the old French word for incense, and the first part, franc, is Old French that means true, pure, and noble, right? And it was given that name because frankincense in its purest form is one of the most potent of all incenses out there. So back in biblical times, the people didn't have much access to hot water or soap, right? Were y'all here this morning? We didn't hear this morning and heard Pastor Rick talk about the feet of the disciples. Yeah, okay. 3 people were here this morning. Thank you. So they didn't have much access to soap and hot water, so perfume and incense was very important to cover up the smell, right? And frankincense was one of the most important and most expensive of all of the different incenses and spices and perfumes. So the wise men brought Jesus some expensive cologne, all right? What's the point of that? Well, to fully understand the significance of this gift, we need to talk about what frankincense was actually used for. For this, we have to go back. We have to go back a long way. Not just 2,000 years to the time that we're talking about when the wise men come to the baby Jesus. But we need to go back another 1,500 years from that point. So going back 3,500 years, 1,500 years before Jesus was even born, back to when God brought the Israelites out of Egypt, right? So if you didn't know, the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and God brought them out. And the first place that he took them to was a place called Mount Sinai. It's on the Sinai Peninsula. And there he gave the Israelites the law. Part of this was the famous 10 Commandments that y'all probably know. You know the 10 Commandments? You've heard of them. You may not know them all by heart. The 10 Commandments were the 10 foundational laws of the Bible, written by God himself onto 2 stone tablets. But in addition to these 10 Commandments, God gave a series of other laws and several very specific instructions on how the Israelites should live, and more importantly for us tonight, how the Israelites should worship God. And these were recorded in various places in the Old Testament, primarily in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. And in Exodus chapters 20 through 31, God gives Moses, who was Israel's leader, instructions on how to build and what to do for the implements of worship that the Israelites were to follow. So a series of very specific animal sacrifices that would atone for the sins of the people. This is what we call the Old Covenant. This was a system of forgiveness of sin and worship of God that was set up to be a temporary system until the Messiah would come and provide a complete payment for the sins of the people and institute the true permanent form of worship. Okay, so what does all this have to do with Jesus' birth? What does it have to do with frankincense? Well, let's look at a part of what God told Moses to do in their worship of him. So look at Exodus 30, verse 34 through 36, and we'll see what one of the things that God told them to do. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Take fragrant spices, gum resin, onycha, galbanum, and pure frankincense," there's our word, "all in equal amounts, and make a fragrant blend of incense, the work of a perfumer. It's to be salted and pure and sacred. Grind some of it to powder and place it in front of the Ark of the Covenant law in the tent of meeting." That's going to be important. "Where I will meet with you. It shall be most holy to you." So part of the worship then that God commanded the Israelites to do was to burn incense in the tent of meeting. This is part of what the Bible calls the tabernacle. So I've got some visual aids here. Here's the tabernacle, all right? Well, we didn't have cameras back then, so this is an artist rendering of it. This was a very special tent that God gave very specific instructions to the Israelites to build in which to worship him. That's how we're able to recreate it, because he even told them how long things should be. And before they came to their permanent settlement in Canaan, where they then built a permanent structure that we know as the temple, they had the tabernacle. Okay, so what did they do with this incense that we just read about? How did it work in the tabernacle? And more importantly, why and how did this worship God? Right? So you can see here there's a structure inside of the tabernacle. So take me inside the tabernacle here. Inside this inner structure, you can see two rooms, right? So on the right side, the outer room, this place is called the holy place, right? And then it's separated from an inner room that's called the most holy place, right? Or sometimes it's translated the Holy of Holies, if you see that in your Bible. All right, so inside the most holy place, that small room, was where the Ark of the Covenant was. This was a large crate covered it completely in gold, which contained the stone tablets containing the 10 Commandments that we talked about, as well as a few other things that Camden read. Right? I guess she read the right verses. Good job. God said that in the most holy place, over the top of the Ark of the Covenant, is where his presence would dwell. Now, between the holy place and the most holy place, you see there's a separation, right? There is a thick curtain that separated the two, and no one at all was allowed to be and ever come into the most holy place except for one time a year, and then it was only the high priest was allowed to enter into the presence of God, where he would offer a blood sacrifice that would roll back the sins of the people for one more year. Okay, so stay with me here. The outer room, the holy place, take me inside of that. Yeah, okay, so here we're in the outer room. That's going to be where we're going to talk about tonight, because one of the things that is most important was there. You can see there's 3 articles of furniture, and Camden read about what these were. We don't have time to talk about the lampstand and the golden table that had the showbread on it. But what's important to us tonight is that one thing in the back that you see right in front of that curtain we were talking about. This is the altar of incense. You see that it's placed right in front of the curtain that was the entrance to the most holy place that no one could go, the place behind which God's presence dwelled. So let's read what God told Moses about this altar, because it seems important. It says incense. We're talking about frankincense. So in Exodus 30, it says this. God told Moses, make an altar of acacia wood for burning incense. And then it goes into like how to cover it in gold and all that. I'm going to skip through that to verse 6. Put the altar in front of the curtain that shields the Ark of the Covenant law. We just said that. Before the atonement cover that is over the tablets of the covenant law, where I will meet with you. Aaron must burn, this is important, Aaron must burn fragrant incense on the altar every morning when he tends the lamps. He must burn incense again when he lights the lamps at twilight. So incense will burn regularly before the Lord for the generations to come. Okay, we start to see it coming together here, right? The holy recipe for incense, which we read about before, that contains the very, very expensive frankincense, was to be constantly burning on the altar of incense. The priest would add more, and they would keep it lit. It never went out. And so this incense was continually burning, giving off its sweet smell directly in front of the most holy place where God's presence was. Okay, so back to the wise men now. Starting to make some connections here. Back to the gifts. So you're probably thinking, okay, cool. So they brought in frankincense, some kind of like expensive, essential oil diffuser. But what does that mean? Why? It still seems like a thing you wouldn't give to a baby. Why is this important? And how does it relate to the temple and the altar of incense? Okay. Well, the New Testament tells us that everything in the temple and the tabernacle was symbolic. It was there to help us understand who God was and what our relationship to him is. Colossians 2 describes it like this, that these things were a shadow of what is to come. Y'all know what a shadow is? I can see it. There's a shadow right here. Can you see it? So a shadow is an outline of something, right? The shadow isn't important, right? It's only there because there's something real that's casting a light. You can't see everything about what's real from the shadow, you only see the outline, right? Only a partial view. So do y'all like symbolism? Okay. Probably not. Yeah, okay. So I was an English major in college, and I used to teach American literature. So I was trained to understand symbolism, but I know that a lot of y'all may be like a lot of my students that had a really hard time grasping symbolism in literature. So the good thing for us is that we don't have to guess at what this incense was a symbol of, because the Bible actually interprets it for us, and it tells us very clearly what the incense was in several places. The most important of which is probably in the book of Revelation, where the Apostle John was given a vision of what will be happening in heaven and on earth at the end of all time. So let's look at that real quick. So in Revelation 5, it says this, starting about halfway through verse 8. The 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, that's Jesus. Each one had a harp, and they were holding, look at this, golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of God's people. Tells us right there. And then down a little bit in chapter 8, it says, another angel had a golden censer and came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to burn, to offer, with the prayers of all God's people. On the golden altar, that sounds familiar, in front of the throne. The smoke of the incense, together with the prayers of God's people, went up before God from the angel's hand. Right, so John tells us very clearly, this sweet-smelling smoke of the burning incense in the temple and in the tabernacle was there to represent prayers going up to God. And remember the location of the altar. That was really important. Put me that top-down view again. Right, you can see it right there before the most holy place. Right at in front of where the curtain would open once a year and the priest would go in. Right in front of where God said his presence would dwell under the old covenant. And remember what I was saying earlier, under the old covenant in the Old Testament, the regular Israelites, like you and me, we couldn't actually go into the most holy place. We couldn't even go into the holy place. Only the priests could go into the holy place, and they couldn't even go into the most holy place. Only the high priest could, and he can only do it once a year. And if he tried to go in at another time, he would die. So, this incense, this prayer, was offered up for the people who couldn't go there themselves by a priest as what we call an intermediary. Do y'all like words? Yeah, I have a PhD in linguistics, so I like words, right? So here's a good word for you. It's an important word for us. Intermediary. This is a legal term for a person who acts as a link between people to try to bring about a reconciliation, right? It's kind of like a lawyer, right? It's someone who intercedes on another person's behalf, a go-between between two parties that are at odds. So the priest, they were the only ones who could go in and offer up that incense, offer up prayers for the people. The priests were there to be an intermediary for the people. All right, so back to the Wisemen and their gift of frankincense to Jesus. The frankincense that represented the incense offered up by the priest in the temple as a representation of intercessory prayer. They gave Jesus this gift, don't miss this, to show that Jesus, as the Messiah, will be our true high priest. Jesus will be our true intermediary. He will be our go-between between us and God. And Jesus wouldn't be like an earthly high priest in the earthly temple, right? Which again was just a shadow, right? That represented the real thing. But Jesus is that real thing. He is our perfect high priest He's not a priest in this earthly temple like the priests here were, but in the real heavenly temple that John sees Jesus in the actual presence of God. Let's look at that. And the writer of Hebrews says this in Hebrews 9:24. It says, "For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made with human hands here on earth. That was only a copy of the true one that's in heaven. But he entered heaven itself now to appear for us as our intermediary in God's presence." So like the gift of gold that Tom talked about last week, showing that Jesus is our King, the Wisemen's gift of frankincense shows that Jesus is also our great high priest. He is also our perfect intermediary, our go-between to God, to talk and advocate to God on our behalf. He's always interceding. Remember how the smoke never went out? He is always interceding to God on our behalf, praying and advocating for all humans directly to God. So as we finish up tonight, and Tillman goes ahead and comes up, I want us to think about how that applies to our life. So we've seen tonight that the tabernacle or the temple under the old covenant with all the sacrifices and all the rituals was just a massive, massive illustration of God's holiness and his inherent separation from sinful humans. Right? Because in the Garden of Eden, we chose our own way. We were permanently separated from God's presence. That's why there was a thick curtain separating the most holy place where God's presence was from the people and even the priests. And why they needed to offer up incense and prayers for us on our behalf because we couldn't go there. Because of this separation, we were without hope, in need of someone to be our go-between, to intercede with God on our behalf. And y'all, that is why Jesus came. That is why we celebrate Christmas at all. That's why Jesus was here. This is what Christmas is all about. Jesus came to be our intermediary, to advocate for us directly with God, because we could not in our sinful state. But because we have free will, we have to accept that for Jesus. We have to turn to him in faith and believe and accept his advocation for us. So let me ask you that tonight. Have you accepted Jesus as your king and as your priest? Because without Christ, we have no other way to God. All that he requires of us is that we accept Jesus' work for us in faith. We put our trust in him. Second, for those of us here tonight who've already done that, who have accepted Christ, who have a relationship with him, this Christmas season, I want you to consider the great privilege that prayer is. Because of the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, spoiler alert, that's represented by the myrrh, which Tom's going to talk about more next week, the curtain that separated the most holy place was torn in two. The Bible tells us that as Jesus died on the cross, from top to bottom, that curtain was torn in two, forever allowing humans into God's presence. Because of Jesus, humans now have direct access to come to God in prayer ourselves, without the need of a human priest to come in and offer up intercessory prayer for us. We have the ability now to approach the presence of a holy God whenever we want because of the sacrifice of Jesus, because we are covered in his blood. So tonight, And throughout this Christmas season, stop and take a minute to appreciate that. Under the old covenant, we could not approach God's presence. But because of Jesus, we now have the privilege to come to Him directly, to come directly into the presence of God in prayer. Anytime we want. But how often do we take that for granted? How often does our incense go out? How often does our prayer life just consist of some mumbled words quickly before a meal, without even considering what a privilege it is by that to approach the presence of God? So I'll end with the words of the writer of Hebrews, summing up why we celebrate the coming of Christ at Christmas. In Hebrews 4, it says this: "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith that we profess." And skipping to verse 16, "Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." God wants us to come to Him and offer up that incense. It's like a sweet smell of perfume to God, the prayers of His people. So let's pray. Dear God,